Hello everybody, Dr. Feist here again, and I'm talking to you about Aristotle and his great work, the Nicomachean Ethics. So now here we are in Chapter 5, Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, talking about a whole bunch of different lives that might enable us to understand what Aristotle is talking about when he says eudaimonia. Remember, I said don't translate that word. Roughly, it kind of means happiness, but don't get too hung up on the English term happiness. We're leaving it as eudaimonia. So it's some kind of greatest good that we're looking for. And as I said, we've got a bunch of lives that might be used, Aristotle says, to help us illustrate what this great good of eudaimonia might be. So he's basically acting, in a sense, like a sociologist, looking at, well, what do people say about eudaimonia? How do they live? And can that give us a hint? What other words in Greek might be the equivalent of eudaimonia? So we're out of the digression of methodology and back into the deep stuff of ethics. And so what exactly is this best good? What is this that everyone agrees to call eudaimonia? Well, if you look at the great masses, Aristotle says, and he uses the term hoi polloi, which has been translated in a variety of ways, but really some people say it's a derogatory term. It's hard to say, but it generally means like the masses or most people. And what they tend to do, he says, is they say that this eudaimonia, the great good for us, really is hedone. And hedone can roughly be thought of as pleasure. That's really what the greatest good, that's what life is all about, is enjoying it, having pleasure. So in that sense, most people would say, simple. Eudaimonia is hedone. That's where we get hedonist, hedonic, all these hedonic calculus, all the things in philosophy, but a hedonism, pleasure. And it can be varieties of forms of pleasure, everything from simple bodily pleasures, eating and drinking and all that kind of stuff, up to maybe higher pleasures like the enjoyment of poetry or playing chess or, reading a good novel, etc., etc. So, but the main idea here is that it's pleasure. And so the good, happiness, identify it with pleasure. And Aristotle is not entirely unsympathetic to this. And let's not get too carried away about the term hoi polloi, as in, it's just the poor or anything like that. Because Aristotle says, it's not without some good reason that some, the hoi polloi, may think that eudaimonia, our greatest good, really is hedone or pleasure. That's not entirely unreasonable. And he invokes the legend of the Assyrian king Sardanapalus, who very powerful, and that's the position he took. So somebody who was running a society, who was in charge, said, yeah, eudaimonia, basically, it's a kind of hedone. It's pleasure. That's what it's all about. So Aristotle says that this is really, in the end, and this is where the derogatory side does come out, it's kind of a life fit for cattle, like fatted cattle. That's really what the life of pleasure is all about. And what Aristotle is saying here is that you can be all very powerful, like Sardanapalus, and still have this sort of cattle view. And clearly Nietzsche, centuries later, picked up on the notion of the cattle, etc., as being the common person and something we have to try to rise above. Well, if that's the case, that this sort of everyday sort of, cattle-like view is going to be eudaimonia is just pleasure, what other alternatives are there? So there's our first way of life, this everyday view, and as I said, he's got 4 of them. So there's a few other groups that Aristotle is going to talk about. But before I get into that, it's something that there's a few things we should think about. Just a couple of comments. First off, so just a couple of comments to make here. Always be careful when you're reading these philosophical texts, because philosophers are trying to sell you some ideas or convince you, whatever term you want to use, of a certain position that they're taking. Now, remember, Aristotle is saying in his work here what the general population may think. So So why trust? Why trust Aristotle, right? This is a philosopher giving you his take on what the general masses think. He may be wrong on this. So this is his view. You should always be careful. And the more general thing I want to say about this is why trust Aristotle as to what the general population says. It's very difficult. We know from trying to take polls, surveys, it's very difficult to say what a general population thinks about a particular issue. Think of how many times polls get the population's mood entirely wrong. So Aristotle is not doing exactly a scientific polling here, and even scientific polls, can go quite awry. So we should always take it with a grain of salt. Maybe that's not quite what most people did think. So I want you to always be reading these texts very critically and asking yourself when someone, like even if it's Aristotle, when they make a claim, well, what's the basis for that claim? He doesn't really justify it. He just makes the claim and moves on. But in the broader sense of thinking about public morality, who gets to say what that really is? Is that through surveys? Should we look at what artists write, what philosophers say, what politicians say, school teachers, etc., etc.? There are a number of ways that we could look into trying to answer the question, what does the general public think? And it's a complicated question indeed. It's certainly not self-evident what the general population is thinking about any issue at any one time. And we often say people are very clever or very gifted if they can read public sentiment, because most of us really can't. So that's the first comment. Just keep in mind that in this chapter, in chapter 5, Aristotle, and this relates somewhat to my first comment about why trust Aristotle, is here he identifies Eudaimonia. Here he identifies the view of the hoi polloi, the general mass, saying that Eudaimonia is to be something to do with hedone, pleasure. In the previous chapter, he had a slightly different take on what the hoi polloi thought. He thought that they identified eudaimonia not just with hedone and pleasure, but with time as well, which is the term for honor. So we've got a bit of a discrepancy in the text. So why trust Aristotle? And is the text consistent? And the answer to that is, for the most part, yes, but not entirely. So you have to be very careful when you're reading Aristotle that some parts of the text may not fit perfectly with others. Now, why is that? Well, we can look at that in a lot more detail, and that tends to get out of the realm of the philosophical aspects of the text. But don't forget, these are ancient works, and since they come from antiquity, they've been changed a little bit over time, passed around, additions have been made, and we're not really entirely sure what exactly comes from the pen of Aristotle. Yes, the Nicomachean Ethics is agreed upon by scholars. No one doubts that it's from Aristotle, but all the particulars inside of the text, if you look at various translations, they do differ in quite a number of ways, and even what is the ultimate source text is not completely agreed upon. But these tend to be smaller discrepancies, but nonetheless, it's good to be aware of them. So, a couple of comments. Why trust Aristotle? Is the text entirely consistent? We've got a small difference here from what he says that the hoi polloi say in this chapter and what he said the hoi polloi said in a previous chapter. That's a small inconsistency, but it is something to keep in mind because there will be a larger, more problematic inconsistency coming later when actually one of the books, it will be book 10, to jump ahead a little bit, book 10 will have trouble fitting in with all the other books of the Nicomachean Ethics. So there are large tensions, and the question is was Aristotle aware of these, or were these later editions, or what's going on here? Or are these different aspects of Aristotle's notes? All kinds of interesting scholarly discussions about the very consistency and integrity of the text. So there's a couple of comments. Note on the third one, by invoking that legendary Assyrian king, Sardanapalus, saying, yeah, he's a lot like the hoi polloi and identified in Eudaimonia with Eudaimonia, or pleasure, Aristotle does make a split, right, between, shall we say, the possession of power, those people that have power, and those people that have wisdom. They're not always the same thing. He clearly was aware of that. We often say that today. You know, lots of people have plenty of power, but we hope they're wise, and unfortunately, it doesn't always turn out to be the case. So, in this sense, Aristotle is splitting the notion of possessing power and possessing wisdom. So it's not the case that we just have those people as sort of at the sociological bottom of society having no wisdom and everybody at the top who has power has wisdom. Aristotle doesn't think that at all. All right. And Aristotle does say, though, as I've mentioned, that this life eudaimonia as Hedone is kind of like the fatted cattle life. This image of the non-human animal, as we would say now, as being satisfied and enjoying all its bodily pleasures, that's not a true human life, as Aristotle would say. That's the life of the fatted cow. That's not a human life for us. This is echoed centuries later if you read John Stuart Mill, and of course his famous line in the 19th century that he said he'd rather be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig. So, in other words, there's a long tradition of not looking to livestock to do our philosophy. So in that sense, we've got a couple of comments here to think about. Aristotle thinks it's not completely without reason to say that Hedone is connected to eudaimonia, but don't equate them. That's the key takeaway. Not to separate them radically, to say, eudaimonia, this greatest good, has nothing to do with pleasure. Aristotle wouldn't agree with that. But to say, then it's everything, it's just pleasure, he'd say no. So he's got a third way. It's got something to do with it, but that's not the whole story. All right, so there's your first way of life by the hoi polloi. And as I said, he's got 4 lives, 4 ways of life here he's going to talk about. So let's carry on and look at a couple of more groups that Aristotle talks about, namely the Carentes and the Practicoi. This group here, the Carentes, these are kind of the cultured. He even refers to them as the beautiful. So these are a special kind of group in society. And you may recognize the English, sort of the English sense of this term, the practicoi, the practical types. Now, what does that mean? Well, more or less of the people that they live and engaged in life of activity, the sort of the doers, so to speak. And in this, as their second way of life, they identify eudaimonia, our greatest good, eudaimonia, with this term here, time. And time is like honor. So what's really important in life is not just to, satiate all your desires and all that. That can be important and amusing and all that. This group's not denying that, but they're saying, look, what's really important about life and living this greatest good and living a good life is to live a life of honor. Now, not surprising, these two groups are, shall we say, more elevated in status and power and with respect to our other group, the hoi polloi. So chances are you've got people that are involved more in the power centers of the society. So their view of the good life is what Aristotle would call a politikon bion, which, well, you can tell by even the pronunciation of it. And by the way, my ancient Greek pronunciation would probably be laughed at by any ancient Greek because I speak it with quite an accent, no doubt, but they're not around to make fun of it. So politikon, political. So political, bion, bios, biology. So that's so time, honor, that's the greatest good. That's the end of your political life, the politikon bios. And remember the term for end is the telos. So what's important to this group, What's the way of life? What's the greatest good? What's your eudaimonia? Well, it's to have honor. That's your telos. That's the end of my life, the goal, the thing that makes my life good and what I search for. And my life is the politikon beyond, my political life. So I'm involved in the aspects of power. All right, so we've got a number of lives here. Now, there's a couple of other things to think about with this in terms of having this time, honor or reverence, deep respect. There's a variety of ways you can translate it, but being highly respected and honored in society. Aristotle says this is something that a lot of people think is important, and he's not denying that it is. And in this sense, if you have this, there's one problem with it. Right? If you think about time and honor, it really can't be equated with eudaimonia. And why is that? Well, the thing that he wants to stress about eudaimonia, this greatest good, is that it can't be something fickle. And when you think about honor, reverence or whatever, we often are puzzled why some people are so honored. In some cases, we're not puzzled. So in some people that have a large amount, shall we say, of arete, and we'll look way more in detail at what arete is, but for now, we can roughly call it, rough translation, as excellence. If you have arete, you're like excellent at doing something. So those people that are engaged in this politikon beyond, this political life, they have a large amount of arete, they have excellence, they're really good at lots of things. We can respect that and we award them time. But on the other hand, the problem is this. As honor can be bestowed when it's deserved, because the person who has a lot of arete, it also can be taken away. So someone could still have all that excellence, and the public mood, well, sometimes being fickle, it can take it away or give it to people that don't really deserve it. We've all been puzzled by why some people are so highly respected, and we can't figure out why. We think, well, they don't have really arete, or what's the issue here? So Aristotle's aware of the fickle nature, as he says, of time. Now, why is it the case, though? Here's the question, the philosophical question. Why is it the case that this greatest good, this agathos, so I haven't talked about that, but another term for good, agathos, is to be identified with this eudaimonia, and it can't be fickle? What's the argument for that? Like, maybe that's just life. Maybe life is just fickle and capricious and whatnot, and so be it, right? Like, enjoy it while it lasts, because it can't last forever, and if times are good, enjoy them, because it can flip on you tomorrow. That's the nature of life. It's, very happy, very sad, it's tragic, it's whatever. Do your best, because you can't really control it. That doesn't appeal very much to Aristotle. That, frankly, he uses another Greek term, Mantle Mesa, and this is like prophesying or to divine, to intuit. This just really, when you think about it, this notion of a greatest good for us, right? This human good, it can't be just something fickle. That is just too much, should we say, of a modern existentialist point of view for Aristotle, that everything could just be perfectly meaningless. This, we will see, clashes deeply with everything that Aristotle talks about. We've seen it a little earlier when he talks about we are creatures who can have our desires fulfilled. We're not just endlessly passionate creatures that can never find any satisfaction in anything. That's something Aristotle rejects. So this notion, like Sartre says, that man is a useless passion, that's rejected by Aristotle. He'd have nothing to do with that. That doesn't fit into his general philosophy. It doesn't fit into his metaphysics. It doesn't fit into his biology. Aristotle thinks that we are not just creatures that live these fickle lives. There is some element to them that can be fickle, yeah, but roughly Aristotle is a person of you can take responsibility and figure things out. And so eudaimonia is not going to be identified with something that is just handed to you. So we're getting lots of hints as to where he's going to go with unpacking this term of eudaimonia and this great good. So think of this, that eudaimonia now we've got is something stable. It's something we're working for. It's not something that's just handed to us and can easily be taken away. No, he disagrees with that. And later philosophers, as I mentioned, Sartre, Hobbes thought Aristotle was completely wrong about this, about our passions and whatnot, and created a very different picture of society and of the human being as well. Now, so there you go. So we've got a couple of these lives here. The third way of life, Aristotle talks about. So the third way of life now, the eudaimonia of that life would be theoreticus, theoretical, contemplative. So that's your contemplative life. So that, well, who's going to push that? Well, that's a philosophical understanding of life. What's the meaning of life? It's not, as we said, it's not like the hoi polloi where eudaimonia is just simply, hedonic. No, it's not that. That can be part of it, but it certainly isn't to be identified with that. It's not going to be as the other groups, the Carentes and the Practicoi, who say that eudaimonia is just time, it's just honor because it's all about power and the politikon beyond, and your telos is just to show off your arete, which Aristotle says that's what most people are doing. They're just showing it off and trying to gather up the time for that. No, there's way more to that life than that. So the third way of life then, eudaimonia, is the contemplative life, theoreticos. Theoretical, doing theory. So that's going to play a bigger role later on in the Nicomachean Ethics. And when we get to Book 10, there's going to be a lot of tensions there, but we'll look at that a little later. So as I mentioned, there's 4 ways. We've got to 3. The 4th way is the life of making money. Sure, that's what some people say. What's life for? Life is to amass wealth. Now, Aristotle he owned property, he owned slaves, all kinds of things. We'll get into that problematic aspect later. But Aristotle wasn't dirt poor, and he valued all kinds of things. So what does he say about that? He gives us another hint about eudaimonia when he makes this mention, when he mentions this about making money. He asks something very straightforward. Sure, you want to make a lot of money. Okay, I get it. But why do you want to make money? This is the key thing. As we've seen earlier on, goods are arranged in clusters and hierarchies. So what's the point of making money? Well, the point of making money, if you talk to people, you want money in order to. I want money in order to buy as many houses as I can buy, or to buy boats or fancy cars or clothes or whatever. But it's always the idea of money is a means to an end. So it's a means to perhaps, money is a means to eudaimonia. Is money equal to eudaimonia? Like, is just the possession of money equal to it? Well, Aristotle would say no. One character that's quite commonly known, of course, is Ebenezer Scrooge in the Dickens story. He's a miser. He just enjoys having money. There's some famous scenes of when he's in the restaurant and he wants another slice of bread, and that would give him pleasure to eat more bread with his soup. And the waiter says, "Yeah, it's going to cost you more," and he goes, "Nah," because the joy of having that money is probably greater than the joy of eating the bread. So the money is not necessarily a means to an end. But Aristotle is saying, in Aristotle's own view and in the general view, money is really not to be equated, but it's a means. It's a means to some other end, not the end itself. So we've got basically now a discussion of 4 groups. And notice we end with this thing on money, so it gives us a hint and as to what eudaimonia is about. It's got to be an ultimate end. It can't be something that's on the way to something else. It's got to be something that may have some relationship to the contemplative life. We'll look at that in more detail. this notion of the divine thing that helps us to understand that it can't be something fickle, right? So this brings in a slight sense of otherworldliness. And Aristotle says, once again, that things like time, honor, that might be a part of the show. And as we learned back over here in our first life with the hoi polloi, that hedone can't be equated by the double arrow, not to be equated, right? Don't do that. But that doesn't mean that you say, oh, well, pleasure's got nothing to do with the good life. That's wrong too. So what we've got is a bunch of lives that say, well, here's one possibility, here's one possibility, but they're all saying, oh, here's one possibility to say what this is. Aristotle is saying, those may play a role, but that's not the final answer. Don't equate it, but don't throw them out. Don't say that eudaimonia has nothing to do with time, or nothing to do with honor, or nothing to do with hedone, nothing to do with pleasure. Don't go that far either. So, Aristotle is always trying to give us middle roots, in a sense, but we don't want to take it that Aristotle always looks for the middle. But he does look for positions that try to take in what he thinks is important and relevant and of value from other positions. So Aristotle is working his way through. So what he's going to do in upcoming chapters is to start fleshing this out in a lot more detail. And what we're going to see now is this notion of arete. This is an important one. People value it in others. They value it in themselves. This is going to be a key term when he starts trying to articulate in more detail what this term really is. So we're on to something here, and we're getting a lot more information as to flesh this out, but we still haven't got a definition or some kind of structure that we can say eudaimonia is this, and that we could fill out in more detail later. So that's enough for this video, and coming up we're going to look at the increasing importance of this term arete, which is like excellence. So stay tuned.